Yep.
Yep.
Hey.
Hey, we're live, folks.
Let's go.
Hi, everybody. Oh, go ahead. Jason, did you want to start? Or do you want me to start?
We're live. Go ahead and start, Chris.
Okay. Hi, folks. Welcome to the Capital Volume 1 reading group. I am Christopher Brew, Chris Brew. That's everybody. Feel free to call me Chris. This is a reading group, and we're all scholars. I'm excited to dive back into Marx's Capital Volume 1. What I'm going to do right now is just have everybody quickly introduce themselves. I'm going to talk and maybe talk briefly about what interests you in Marx. If you could do that briefly. I know that that's not an easy thing. But anyway, I just finished my second book this last fall called Insistence of the Material, and it's interested in putting. It was interested in looking at issues of materiality in relationship to Marxist materialisms, among other things, in biopolitics. And now I'm trying to work up a theory book based on a number of the essays I've been publishing right now that really takes up the question of materiality and materialism in a more developed way, and really tries to rethink a number of categories in terms of that. So anyway, that's who I am. I'm really excited to do this, and I want to thank Jason Adams and Carlos Amador for making this possible, and for what the New Center does, and which I think is really a cool thing. It feels very non-dogmatic and open to different voices, and yet an important voice on the left in itself. So I'm very happy to be here as well. So anyway, that's me. Ashley, do you want to talk about yourself next, quickly?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm an assistant professor. I'm Ashley Black. I'm an assistant professor at Edgewood College, small liberal arts college in Madison, Wisconsin. And my interest in Marx at the moment has a lot to do with thinking about constructions of labor and materialism and so forth in relation to slavery, in particular U.S. slavery, constructions of black bodies and so on. So that's my more focused interest in terms of what I'm doing research on right now, but it's also good to go back, and I'm a real Foucauldian, like everybody these days in certain ways. I'm thinking about biopolitics. So for me, historicizing is also very important to look at the longevity of terms and things like that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Thanks. And I'm so glad you're holding this too.
Thanks. Carlos?
I'm up. I thought you were going from left to right. Hi, I'm Carlos Amador. I'm assistant professor of Spanish and Culture Studies at Michigan Technological University. Guarantee you I'm the most rural person here, so that's something to be said. Lots of snow up there. Right now, I'm talking to you from my my former PhD home of Austin, Texas, UT Austin. My interest in Marx, a lot of things, is 20th century Latin American literature and classic arts scholar. Obviously, not only the influence of Marx through the revolution of the Cuban Revolution and the different guerrilla groups in the region are of a paramount importance to me. But my personal, my first book, which I'm working on finishing for Palgrave Macmillan in the fall, is on intersubjectivity and sort of Deleuzian and Hallwardian kind of model around the question of forming dictatorship. And as I've researched, I've decided to get more and more into Marxism, Marxism is not just in terms of talking about capital, but actually how to do materialism with stuff already present. The methods of materialism. So one of the things that I'm looking at is how to explore what a real materialist, in scare quotes, what a materialist method means, beginning in media res, which is sort of how Marx's Capital begins. So my next project hopefully is going to be on poetic theories and filmic theories of materialism in early 20th century Latin American literature. So, because I think that there's some real points of confluence there. And that's it. That's my thing. And I'm really privileged to be part of this. Let me just say one thing. And this is a part of the Post-capitalism Research Group attached to the New Center for Research and Practice. And we have a lot at the New Center. I'm a lifetime member. Jason is one of the founders and organizers, and I'm really privileged to work with this, and I think that the research group represents a really powerful and mobile, flexible way to do the kind of conjunctural political and theoretical work that we all are really interested in, whether it be from the historical perspective of slavery to the slightly more contemporary perspective of my work in the early 20th or mid 20th century, Jason or Chris's, whomever. Like, I think this is a really good opportunity for us to work. So thanks for letting me give my spiel about the Post-Capitalism Research Group, and I'm one of your facilitators, and hope to do a good job for you all. Next, let's see. There you go.
Oh, hey, me?
Jeff Higgins. Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. I'm Jeff Higgins. I work in publishing, kind of, and well, my interest in Marx stems from just a general interest in alternatives to capitalism and an interest in materialism, simply, which is important also to my work as a writer and filmmaker, etc. I do a lot of creative, quote-unquote, creative things. I don't know.
He does lots of cool stuff. I'm here to vouch. So, Christina, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Christina.
All right. I'm a graduate student at the University of Toronto, and I work on 19th century American literature. So I guess, like Ashley, the chapter I'm working on now is sort of thinking about the slippery slope between slavery and wage labor. So that's like my immediate interest in returning to Marx now, but I have always sort of wanted to read Capital from cover to cover. So I'm jazzed to be here.
Excellent. Janice, do you want to speak?
Sure. I've been a long time activist and have been married to a professor at the university, but not been one. But I've been in the workforce for a number of years, and I'm retired now, but still active in social movements, environmental and labor, and economic justice movements. We just recently went to Left Forum in New York and attended some of the panels on black cooperatives, and there was a speaker at one who popularized or somehow imaged basic capitalist relations more beautifully I've ever heard. And I'd like to kind of learn how to do that, you know, think reflexively in the Marxist vein. So when we encounter various slogans on the right that are really capitalist slogans, we can actually counter them with what's really going on in the economy so people understand it in not a simplified way, but a way that it immediately makes sense. And that's what he did. It was wonderful.
Excellent. Thank you, Janice. And I should also add that, yeah, Janice and her husband, Carol, have been sort of at the center of left politics in the town I live in, the town Normal, for many, many years. We owe them an incredible amount because they fought for justice and you know, for any number of causes. So, in fact, I think Carol was actually censured by the state legislature at one point because he was such an active and radical professor, and you know, I can't think of a greater honor than that. So, okay, Julian, do you want to talk?
Yes, sorry,
Julian?
I was muted there.
No problem.
Yeah, I'm a master's student at UVic. I live in Victoria, BC, Canada. Just very excited to read Marx with everyone. I haven't really read Marx seriously since undergrad, which was now 7 years ago for me. I did teach a tutorial or lead a tutorial where we were discussing the manifesto in the fall, which was really fun to see kind of the take on that text with 19, 20-year-olds, and there's some really brilliant stuff and hilarious stuff. I'm working on a thesis kind of about Foucault and friendship, and I'm interested kind of in reading the text and looking at kind of like the effective dimensions of capitalism, and interested in the problem of kind of like isolation and connection, and yeah, that's sort of problematic, alienation, and how capitalism requires connections, and it's often critiqued for being something that's isolating and disconnecting, but it actually is kind of bringing people together in order to foster that isolation. So that's kind of what I've been thinking about, and then also just kind of what Marx has to say about human, non-human relations, relations of humans to like greater, more than human world, and how kind of his criticisms are in some ways kind of reinforcing a certain domination of the non-human world. And I've also been a student and a practitioner of anarchism and anarchist projects for a long time, and so have a interest and antagonistic relationship to Marx because of that.
Excellent. It's good. I'm glad to have the anarchist perspective, and I think that's important. So, and I don't. One of the things I hope we get out of this is that to me, the point of this, and this is one of the things I really love that's fostered by the News Center too, is the point is not to take one specific approach, but to really have a productive dialogue between different approaches, or a productive argument for that matter. So, so by the way, how do you respond? How do you type into these things? I keep seeing these types, this type stuff coming up. Do you just type and words come up? Is that how it?
No, there's a little chat icon on
the word bubble on your left-hand corner. There's square word bubble.
Oh, I see. Oh, got it.
Google always has
good.
Thing.
Okay, cool.
If you click the square word bubbles, it'll put a sidebar, and you can just chat below, and you can drop web links, and I believe you can also add, if you have PDFs or other files for essays and whatnot, you can add them in this chat bar too. So
okay. Okay, I see it now. This is cool. Okay, excellent. Okay, yeah, something's making some weird noise. I don't know what that is. Are people getting that feedback? I mean, I kind of like it as somebody who's into weird electronic music, but
yeah, I'm having trouble hearing. It's very broken up, in the last like 10 minutes.
Everybody who's not currently speaking should mute your microphone. Just so you know, and that will solve the problem. But don't let that stop you. Don't let that stop you from speaking, though. Just unmute yourself when it's time.
Okay, that sounds good. Leanne, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, I'm Leanne Tonge. I'm at University of Houston, Victoria, the other Victoria. Yeah, no, I've always been sort of, I'm here assistant professor of English. I've always gone to Marx through, Raymond Williams, Terry Eagleton, sort of cultural materialist angle, but without reading Marx as a whole. I've not read, of course, all of Capital. I've read fragments that I found useful. I'm working right now for some reason. Well, I guess I've done a bit of work on debt in the past year, and that's the theoretical writings is currently out on debt. Draw you inevitably back to Capital. So it's actually clearing up a lot of the stuff. I should have done it the other way around. Yeah, at the moment I'm just starting a paper on resource development conflict for this sociological magazine or journal, sorry. Yeah, basically it's about the whole journal is about redefining war, and so I'm looking at the militarization of protest policing and Bill C-51 in Canada in the Canadian context. And basically looking at, finance, global finance has eroded national sovereignty. So, the trade agreements and the investor protection and those priorities. so just looking at it in terms of capital sovereignty, capitalists as sovereign, as global sovereign, and how that redefines sort of militarized conflict, or at least one-sided asymmetrical militarized conflict. So that's, I haven't quite put it together, obviously, but that's my next project for the next month and a half. So I don't know if that made any sense.
Yes, of course. No.
Okay.
Thank you, Nathan.
It did. I'd be interested in your work.
Okay.
Excellent. Yeah, we should. That's one of the things we can actually do on the sidebar, is even exchange pieces if we want.
Yeah.
Nathan, do you want to introduce yourself? Is he here?
Sure.
Okay.
Yep, that's me. You hear me?
Yep.
I'm a PhD student at Clemson University, and I guess my interest in Marx, I've discovered him as a teenager a long time ago, and read Capital like a good little Marxist, and I guess I'm interested in rereading it to see how differently I interpret it. That makes sense?
Yes, there we go. Now I'm speaking. Yes, thank you. Jason, do you want to introduce yourself, or would you rather pass? Is he here?
Hi, my name is Jason Adams. I'm one of the organizers of the New Center. My background is, I actually started in anarchism from about early 90s until probably mid-2000s. The more I read of post-structuralism, the more I was drawn away from anarchism in particular, and the more I read people like Hart and Negri, the closer I got to Marx. And then when the economic crisis hit, I pretty much went all the way over to Marx. But I'm still influenced by post-structuralism. I taught a class at Williams College called Marx Beyond Marxism, and basically taught kind of the minor tradition of small m Marxism and kind of autonomous Marxism and that sort of thing. So that's kind of my background.
Excellent, thank you, Jason. And Jason's also you're the founder, right, of the New Center as well, right?
We actually intentionally decided to not have founders.
Okay.
If there were founders, though, it would be us three on the organizing committee together, and then also the entire board at one time.
That makes sense. I value. Oh, sorry. I value the politics of that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so that's basically kind of what our thinking was.
That makes sense. I'm still getting used to turning on and off the mic. Tyler. And now yeah, go ahead.
Noah.
Tyler and Noah. That's right. Yes, go ahead.
I'm a grad student at McMaster University in Hamilton. Trying my best to finish a dissertation looking largely at theories of subjectivity in debt, popular representations of debt, issues of financial literacy, and applying a kind of a critical pedagogical framework to a lot of these questions. I guess Marx is kind of a blind spot in my graduate education. I've never read, like a lot of us, it comes through secondary text, but I've never actually sat down and read Capital, so I'm pretty excited about that. Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm Noah. I'm a PhD student at University of Toronto as well. I'm working on Victorian novels and representations of inheritance in response to the credit economy that was intensifying at the time. So I've read some political economy from the 19th century by more British authors. I read some of Volume 3 last year to try to get a handle on the idea of fictitious capital. But I think it would probably be a good idea to start at the beginning and get down some of the basic concepts. So I'm looking forward to doing that in a more systematic way.
Excellent. Well, welcome all of you, and it's a pleasure to meet some of you and to see many of you who I've met in different contexts. And this is an awesome group. What a cool collection of people. I'm very excited about this. So, what I was thinking we could first do, and Carlos, let me know if this works, but you know, is to see if people have questions more generally about Marx's method in Capital, because you know we can dive into the specifics, and I'm happy to do that, but it might need some framing as well. So, do people have responses or questions about it? It could be questions about the dialectic. It could be questions about how much he's indebted to Hegel or not. You know, which is also obviously a matter of interpretation. It could be it could be questions about why does Capital start with the commodity, among other things. Any questions about his more general methodology, why he calls it materialism, you know, or historical materialism, those kinds of questions. Thoughts.
I'm totally okay with that. I think it's great that we start from wherever we're inspired to start, and it sounds like you're inspired to start from that point, and I think that that's a place that Jason and I, and anybody can work off of. So, you know, I know you prepared some notes, right? You mentioned you had prepared some notes.
Yeah, I did. So I'm happy to go to the notes, but I'm just wondering if people have sort of large. Are there any large comments? Having now read Capital, you know, the parts that we read, and I know not everybody may be fully caught up. You know, these things happen. But you know, were there questions that were standing out to you in terms of methodology, in terms of Marxist methodology, or thoughts about it? Not just questions, thoughts is you know, or even better. Okay, well, I'm happy to talk briefly about the questions around methodology. But let me give a little more time. Anybody have a?
Let's put something on the table. I'm trying to find the essay, and at least as a challenge, I have the McClellan, the big book of the McClellan. But you know, one of the things that I think is important that we talk about is that this sort of basic question of matter, and I'll put it to you, and I'll put it to everybody, is that my perception of it, not only reading from there's an essay or a little section of an essay called Materialist Premises in History by Marx, and I'll get the book out once somebody else is talking from the shelf so I can leave the seat, is this question of material is very much about stuff, objects, and not just social relations, but rather the fact that social relations themselves. I don't think Marx is a full idealist, but in the first chapter, the beginning where it says the two factors of the commodity, right? The commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing which through its quality satisfies human needs of whatever kind. So my question to put on the table is a sort of a challenge I'm not committed to, is this idea of stuffness having its own kind of unity, right? Like there are objects. Marx, in a sense, is kind of, no pun intended, an object-oriented ontologist, right? Like stuff is out there, and then it has qualities, and these qualities have a kind of secondary, or really not secondary in terms of priority, but they actually have this added set of qualities, which is the satisfiable. They're satisfiable qualities, right? They satisfy human needs of whatever kind. He talks about the stomach, the imagination makes no difference, which is to me a really important second turn. But we'll start with, that's my thing. Let's put out there, are we talking about object, like stuff?
Excellent. Yeah, this is how I read that, and this is just my reading, and I encourage people to come up with different readings, different takes, argue with either of us. My reading of that is that there is that Marx is both dealing with matter, you know, with objects, with stuff. Yes, he is object-oriented in a certain way, you know, avant Lillet. But on another level, his idea of what materialism is both connected to that, but also distinct. My reading is that materialism is really about the shaping of forces. That there are forces that limit. Both enable and limit human possibility. And that has a relationship to stuff often. It manifests in stuff. It manifests in various kinds of concretions. One of the dialectics that plays out throughout the whole all the chapters we read today is the dialectic between the abstract and the concrete, the way in which exchange value and exchange quantifies things and renders them abstract, and the ways that commodities, though, also function as both in their qualities as use value and in their thingly qualities, if they are commodities that are things, that they have a specific concrete materiality. Labor also becomes abstracted from, the only way in which you get value in the chapter is that labor gets abstracted from specific concrete different manifestations of labor, and yet then it becomes also reconcretized in the body of the laborer, reconcretized in the commodities that are produced, and so on. At least that's how I read it. So that I'm not. One of the things I think is important is to both recognize that Marx is materialist, partly because he's dealing with industrial capitalism and because agribusiness has also not been effaced, so that the version of capitalism he's dealing with is very much about stuff. I still think that that's true with our version of capitalism, but because the leading edges of capital are now about financialization and are about, what Hart and Negri call immaterial labor, that's not always clear to me. It's not always as clear to contemporary thinkers that in fact there is still this material dimension. But to me, at least for Marx, materialism means a setting of limits, the way in which forces enact both possibilities and limits for human agency, for social struggle and social possibility at any given historical juncture. Does that make sense to people?
Yeah, can I jump in?
Or other thoughts? Yes.
Is that cool? Yeah, this is just, if we're thinking about Marx's materialism, the question I was kind of trying to think about is like his main concept, the idea of value is immaterial but objective. So if we're thinking about like the stuffness of matter, it doesn't, his language almost seems to go the other way, like the objectiveness of like things actually existing, but they're being immaterial. Something like what a social relation is, right? So I sometimes find it hard to think about Marx as a materialist in the object-oriented way, precisely because he wants to resist a certain version of like the vulgar materialist. He's like, I'm not like that. I have a different, like even in the first thesis on Feuerbach, the problem with all materialisms before is that they were just about stuff, right? His materialism is about relation, or putting, and I like the idea of forces. Like forces to me seems to get at that problem. I'd be interested though. I'm not committed to this position, but it's my.
No, I don't. Again, I think that you guys both hit the nail on the head, and in many ways, I wanted that first order kind of provocation on the table, because I think I think that we're going to find through our reading that we're absolutely that Marx is really, in this little piece on the German ideology, he talks about. They are the real individuals, their activity, and the material conditions under which they live, both those which they find already existing and those produced by activities. These premises can be thus verified in a purely empirical way, and I think he really does mean what you guys are saying. The social relations are implicit, but I also just wanted to put on this notion of that one of the things that use value to me is so interesting about is that there's still this kind of tension that stuff is always stuff objects are always objects in relations to humans.
Oh.
They really are, and they have they can have an extrinsic quality, but when we start going to notions of the metabolic rift and the way organic composition of capital and the constant capital, we're going to come up with this sort of tension that I think will be productive to look at, is how stuff is both social relations, absolutely. We don't have exchange value if we don't have social relations. But I also want to create that tension, if anything, just to kickstart the conversation. I'm not committed to it either. I just wanted to push it out there because I knew it would have something to people would be able to give.
In my own work, I am kind of committed to thinking through the tension between object-oriented types of materialism, or speculative realism, or new materialism, whatever name we want to use for it, and Marxist materialism. But I think it's important that we recognize both the points of intersection, use value being one of them. Concretizations, as Miranda Joseph talks about them, would also be one of them. But also moments where you do have abstraction. And a friend of mine, Christian Haynes, was just writing this essay about what he calls real abstraction. And Marx actually uses that phrase at one point, and later on, I could probably find it in my notes. But that comes back to Christina, your comment, which is that, in fact, the materialism for Marx is often about these things that are congealed, but they're abstract things that are congealed, but they still have the force of a kind of material thing. That the whole financial system is on some level a version of that. That it's a congealed, also money itself is a congealed form that's an abstract form at the same time. So I think it's a really important emphasis. Other people, or Christina, if you want to follow up.
I think he addresses this in the postface to the second edition, kind of, in drawing the distinction between his dialectical method and Hegel's dialectical method. I think it has to do with starting points. Like, he is a materialist, but he's also about the relations. But he starts from the material world instead of starting from the idea. So, in this version, that I have, it's page 102. I don't know. It's Penguin. It says, my dialectical method is, in its foundations, not only different from the Hegelian, but exactly opposite to it. For Hegel, the process of thinking, which he even transforms into an independent subject under the name of the idea, is the creator of the real world, and the real world is only the external appearance of the idea. With me, the reverse is true. The ideal is nothing but the material world reflected in the mind of man and translated into forms of thought. So the ideal does exist, but it isn't the starting place. It starts from the material world, right?
Which means that at some level...
I think
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Who said that?
That was me. I just wanted to touch on Christina's points again about abstraction. I forget the words that she used, and thank you for that. Is that here we can see how fetishism is an idealism, right? How fetishism is going to be a kind of ideal abstraction that is both, what it says in here, reflected and translated into forms of thought. This material set of relations is going to be translated into forms of thought, and the interesting thing for me is how it turns into fetishism, right? Then we can talk about that later, but I wanted to, how that will become a kind of spectrality, how it will become a sort of illusion, a magical form of thinking for Marx, which is a really interesting, I think, question. I just wanted to put it on the table for later. All right, here. Sorry.
Other thoughts? Anybody want to jump in?
Not for the moment.
Who's that? Okay, well, the other question to me that question of fetishism is interesting, because one of the striking things about commodity fetishism is it works the opposite way of the way in which Marx usually talks about ideology. And you're right, Carlos, that it usually, at least in my reading of Marx, he often talks about the ideal or the imaginary, the linguistic. I mean, these are all different categories that you could substitute or play with around that. I'm not saying they're all the same thing, but and we can talk about that. But he usually thinks that mass material contradictions and material relations, right? That's usually the structure of ideology. But one of the interesting things to me about commodity fetishism, we can look at the chapter really quickly, or the section. This is on 163, is that it becomes about materialization rather than abstraction. This comes back to, I think, to Christina, what you were talking about, that there's that the commodity actually is a thing that in its thingliness is actually ideology. It's ideology congealed. What it masks is actually social relations, and instead it becomes a relationship between things. So it's actually a process of materialization rather than idealization in that case, which I think is really rich. Here it is.
Could you go back on that again? Sorry.
Oh,
I think
sure,
I lost
no sorry.
Is a process of.
Okay, I probably did it really.
Really, yeah. I think you were just like thinking with it. So the process, the way the commodity is a process of not concretization but idealization, or the opposite? I need to just I delete that last sentence again.
Oh, sure.
Give us
I was actually saying that it's a concretization rather than an idealization. That, in fact,
right.
What you have are social relations, right, which are material relations, but they're also, but they are hidden by this, this thing that actually is concretized. That it's commodities in the relationship to money that covers over that social relationship or hides. So here, ideology works by materialization rather than by idealization. It's an already abstracted materialization, but it's a materialization nonetheless.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting given, I don't know if you guys see Carlos's question on the side, how does the materialist method yield the insight of commodity fetishism? Because it would seem like the opposite, because Marx is like, we think the commodity is like a sensuous, use the word sensuous, like it's like we only deal with it in its thingliness. So then why does materialism take you to the reading of the social relation? Is that what you're sort of asking, Carlos? That sort of problem, like how are we getting to this point?
Well, I think, in that postface, it's very clear that let me find the quote again, because it says it's the precise opposite of Hegel's dialectic, which Hegel begins with the idea. The ideal is nothing but the material world reflected in the mind of man, and thus translated into the forms of thought. So I guess what I really wanted to sort of get at was to see if we could get, and now that Chris got to this point, I think it actually idealizes, no pun intended, what we're doing, right? Is that we begin in media res from this question of social relations, and we give in media res with the object, right? The real world if the real world is only the external appearance of the idea, and the reverse is true, that means that the idea is actually the internal appearance of the real world, right? That's that linguistic term. And so what I'm trying to get at is this way of what Chris talked about, concretization. What is really happening with a commodity as a thing that allows us to come up with this notion of commodity fetishism that is itself the concretization of all these different social relations in the material body of an object. And I don't know if it says it, I haven't looked at the footnotes in a while, but I'm a little tiny bit behind on this, but you can think about things like the golden bow and that concept of fetish, or even the Freudian concept of fetish, right, where something is, all sorts of energies are channeled into one specific object that represents for a society a whole series of material and social relations. So, I mean, I know how you can see that. That was what I was trying to get at, if that makes sense. Probably doesn't, because I'm a little tough.
Absolutely.
Yes, and
no, it absolutely does. And I think this becomes...
I'm waking up.
Go ahead, Christina.
Do you want to go? I should go? Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah? Sorry. Okay, just as a note for people, I found it helpful, but when I was when they were talking about, like, thinking about fetishism, like what it means, like what it meant for Marx in like the historical sense, it just as a way of his, like, I guess the gripe with the bourgeois economists was that they weren't reading commodities historically. They were reading them as like natural economic forms, like naturally existing things. So that was the fetishizing process, like reading them as like these sort of natural, non-historical things, sort of. I mean, people can correct me if I'm wrong. I came across it in some secondary reading. I thought it was useful because when I had read it before, I would often make like allied between like a Freudian version of fetishism or a modern common way we might think of a fetish, but he means it maybe in a very specific way. I don't know if that's helpful for people in thinking through that, but so I found it useful.
But he also
yeah,
in the
I think that's right, and that is part of his critique of.
Oh, sorry. There's like a delay, I guess. At the same time, I think he seems to be gesturing towards like maybe anthropological ideas at the time, or proto-anthropological ideas of cultures that invested objects with a life of their own, because in the section on the fetish, his own language continually sort of animates commodities. So I felt like that was kind of, he's sort of trying to rhetorically enact for us the kind of way that we see commodities as though they have a life of their own, I guess. So I think that's also what he's getting at with the fetish, but like over and out.
Yeah, over and out.
Yeah,
Over and out.
There's a couple things he's doing on one level.
Click it.
Mark. Oh.
Hello?
Hello?
What's happening here? Are you stuck? Are you frozen, Chris?
Hello?
He's back.
Is everything okay?
Chris is seeming to be frozen. Chris, come through. At the edge. All that I'm doing is say. All right, he'll come through now. That's him knocking on the table.
He can always come in by phone if necessary.
Do you think we should have him
Yeah. How about we do this?
Can you hear me now?
There he is.
Oh.
Wait. It's gone.
Are you there, Chris? Okay, I have a suggestion because Chris is not coming through. I'm going to try to bring him in via my phone. Oh, wait, there he is. Is it working now, Chris?
Hello? Hey. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's a little bit.
I can hear you guys. I don't know what's going on your end.
No, it was your image completely froze for about a minute, and the audio was not coming through at all.
You can go back to try. Can people hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Folks?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. One of the things I was trying to say to just pick up on the. Okay.
Hello.
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 Let's see. How are you guys seeing hearing me?
I'm gonna try to bring Chris in via phone. And in the meanwhile, there's a question from the Facebook chat, and this is from Yvette, I believe. It's from Yvette Granada, and she asks, in Graham Harman's OOO, he says that objects are not used by their relations, are commodities used up by their relations in Marx. And I was wondering if maybe Carlos could address that while I try to bring Chris in via phone.
Thank you. Okay, I'm echoing, right? All right, perfect.
It's fine.
I think, okay, I'm looking for, okay, so there's this place where he talks about in 149, the Penguin edition, and he's talking specifically about the value relation, right? He's talking about the bodily form of iron is considered for itself no more than the form of the appearance of the weight. The sugar loaf, what he's talking about is he's setting that up on terms of the transition to use value becoming the form of its appearance opposite value, right? But one of the things that I think is important to realize is that not every object has the same use value. I think Marx is pretty, I mean, I know what Harman would like to mean, or what he says objects are used up, not used up in the relations. In Bells and Whistles, he talks about objects always withdrawing, but objects have a certain use value. A sugar loaf is going to be expended by its use value. It's just simply the case of a sugar loaf, or the use value of iron is not expended if it's transformed into a girder or some other material for use. So I don't think that Marx has a mysterious or even ultra-phenomenological notion of the concept of object. What happens is how use value is transformed into a sort of first spectral appearance of value. Right? He just kind of puts it as value in order to have the secondary step, I think, this is my reading, towards exchange value, right? Which is sort of the crux of this matter, is how it transformed to exchange value. So I guess if that's my answer, I hope it's satisfactory. But I'm not sure that some objects get used up and some objects don't. I think a good way to talk about it would be constant capital, right? Some objects in constant capital, before we get into the capital plus variable capital to equals surplus value algorithm, some objects just get used. Oil gets used. Liberate carbon. So maybe I'm being a little bit too naively materialist, but I don't know, Chris. What do you think about that? I'm reluctant to give Marx any sort of analogous relationship to Grant Harmon's object.
Sure. Can you?
Yeah. So.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Okay. Okay. Oh, now I'm getting an echo though. That's all right. Yeah, I think that's right. I think in general, I think that's right. I think that there is a kind of that the object with use value is absolutely sensuous, and it's absolutely qualitatively different from all other objects, exactly like you were saying, Carlos. What's interesting, though, is given Marx's Hegelian method, and given the way in which everything proceeds by negation, which I value. Can people still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
That because for Marx everything proceeds by negation. What happens is that when something becomes exchange value, as Marx says, that there's not one element of matter in it as exchange value, and he likes to posit. I mean, on some level, I'm okay with that because it suggests that exchange is merely about exchange. It's merely about this congealed quality that functions within the commodity. That is its spectral dimension, as you were talking about it, Carlos, before. But on another level, he talks about how commodities get used up. He has a very kind of functional relationship often to use value. And to me, one of the questions that OOO folks are talking about is that whether, in fact, the use of an object, the presence of the object, the materiality of the object actually gets used up when we consume it. And I'm not sure that that's the case at all. That, in fact, one of the ways in which we could expand and complicate Marx is by articulating a notion of use value in which certain aspects of the object remain withdrawn in Harmon's terms, right? Certain aspects of whatever this qualitative thing is remain withdrawn and remain non-human and not fully shaped by the human on a certain level, even as we still have to think about the process of exchange. To me, part of this is where Adorno was trying to think past Hegel's dialectic as well, where he was trying to think a negative dialectic, where something remains from what you've negated that you can't. I mean, that's also in Hegel in a certain way too, right? That something remains from what you've negated, and we could call that the withdrawn quality on a certain level. Does that make sense to folks?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So that's at least one of the ways I would think about that question. Go ahead.
I just want to just note this, and I'll put this in the side. On 149, he talks about in the 149 of the Penguin edition, toward the end, he says he's talking about the coat here. One of the things he says, so the coat therefore seems to be endowed with its equivalent form, its property of direct exchangeability by nature, just as much as its property of being heavy or its ability to keep us warm. Hence the mysteriousness of the equivalent form, which only impinges on the crude bourgeois vision of the political economist when it confronts him its fully developed shape, that of money. Right? So he's talking about this kind of the sort of semantic jump that money gets to do with all things, right? Both gets to include the natural world of the coat as use value, but moreover, I think this is exactly what you were talking about. He's really suggesting that exchange value trumps the circuit of relations that creates value, kind of trumps all other notions of use value. And I put that in the sidebar. You don't need to sell a coat as qua coat. You could sell it as art. You could sell it as any number of things, right? But the bourgeois economist makes a confusion between use value and exchange value in all of their work. In other words, misperceiving the relations of the social relations that create the commodity as essentially creating commodities that always have use value. And so what he's saying is there's this kind of short circuit of comprehensibility that happens in this. And this is really tough to wrap your head around, because bourgeois economists can just extend use value sort of ad infinitum by creating different markets. But he's saying no, that there's a fundamental formula, mechanism in which the object gets transformed into value, is eventually into exchange value. So this is what you were talking about, the Hegelian method. I just wanted to point out that this is on that page. Sorry for the long excursus.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, I think that's right. We seem to have lost a couple people. Nathan and Janice, are you gone?
They're still up. They might have just logged out. They might have just.
No, I'm here.
Yeah, might have just.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I just posted on chat. It's easier.
Oh, good. I know it is easier.
I'll be happy to run the chat.
Okay, cool.
We have a new person
to come back to
join in the middle.
Oh, okay. Hi, new person. Who's here? Who's new?
Esther, I believe.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Hello.
Hey, Esther.
Hi.
Good. I'm good. Other questions. One thing I wanted to pick up really quickly that Christina, you were talking about, and Carlos, you were talking about, was I think there's three movements that in Marx's text. One is towards a kind of one is towards a kind of like demystification that is materialist, of revealing the material underpinnings to ideological or idea-based conceptions. But another one is the historical critique, which I think, Christina, you were alluding to, which is the way in which any present understanding of relationships without a historical understanding of the emergence of the presence as such is a misunderstanding, according to Marx. It is, in fact, a fetishistic understanding, right? So the present fetishism. I mean, if we were talking about the OOO critique or engagement of Marx, we could also talk about the Marxian critique of OOO. One of the Marxian critiques of OOO is that it tends to be preoccupied, fixated on contemporary materiality to the degree that it doesn't theorize its historicity. That's not always true, but that it runs the danger of not theorizing its historicity or its relationship to larger systemic domains. And that's the other part of Marx's critique, is that everything has to be understood in this complex system that's about negations, and the movement of negation in various ways. And so, that's also part, ideology critique involves all three of those movements: historicization, totalization or systematization, and materialization would be the three ways I see Marx working, if that helps. Other questions, comments?
What did you say? The third one?
I was thinking.
I love that organization. Materialization. Yeah, and I think that's just to if we can, hopefully, I mean, I don't want to maybe table, if it's okay with everybody else, the question of OOO is that, at the end of the day, no matter what historicization, totalization, materialization does to an object, or at least for Graham Harman and to a lesser degree, I mean, Levi Paul Bryant might disagree with me, but I know that for Graham Harman and for Timothy Morton, the idea of the phenomenological experience of an object is really sort of the baseline. And we have to get into a whole conversation of whether or not phenomenology can include these questions of historicization, totalization, and materialization in the apperception of an object. But right. I think that's a conversation that OOO has not really had very, very effectively, and may, in point of fact, be kind of sort of barrier between Marxian critique and the critique of objects. But I will say that Nicole Shukin's book, Animal Capital, to get back at that, in the first chapter, she touches on this way of talking about objects, especially with regards to rendering cattle into consumable objects. Rendering livestock into consumable objects. So,
can I just interject for just a minute and just if you're not using your microphone at this precise moment, if you could just mute it, because it creates like a robot sound somehow. And Esther, would you mind doing that too? Just muting until you're ready to talk.
I'm muting. All right. Yes, absolutely.
Just until you're ready to talk. Like as soon as you're ready, just unmute it, and you know.
I don't know how to unmute it.
Hold on. Just yeah, there you go. Okay, great. Thank you.
I wanted to maybe pick up the question. There's a couple people. We were talking about materialization and idealization, and I should say that maybe both are a moment of ideology. I wanted to maybe point to two passages in the commodity section. I also want to pick up the question of slavery, though, because one of the things that came up in the a number of you talked about this. I think both Christina and Ashley, and I know some of people's, like Tyler, your work in biopolitics might also link up to questions of slavery, among other things. Marx does pick up on the issue of slavery and makes reference to it in one of the prefaces, and also at one point in what we read for today. But before that, I just wanted to pick up two passages really quickly in the fetishism of commodities. This is right from 163, right at the beginning of the fetishism of commodities and its secret. But the analysis brings out that there's a very strange thing abounding in metaphysical it is a very strange thing abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. So that seems to be a version of idealization as ideology. Nevertheless, the table continues to be wood, an ordinary sensuous thing. But as soon as it emerges as a commodity, it changes into a thing which transcends sensuousness. It not only stands with its feet on the ground, but its relationship to all other commodities, it stands on its head and evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas, far more wonderful than if it were to begin dancing of its own free will. Probably the most famous lines from all of Capital, right there. But the thing that I think is interesting there is here he's paradigm that idealization is ideological, right? But look at the next. You skip a paragraph here. And it works the opposite way. The mysterious character of the commodity form consists therefore simply in the fact that the commodity reflects the social characteristic of men's own labor as objective characteristics of the products of labor themselves, the socio-natural properties of these things. Through these, a little bit further, through the substitution, the products of labor become commodities, sensuous things that are at the same time supersensual, sensible, or social. And so what's interesting is the movement back and forth between the sensual and the non-sensual, or between the sensual and the ideal. Thoughts? Maybe I want to chime in. Can folks hear me?
Can people hear me now? I have a question about that.
Yes.
I feel like I'm not as up on a lot of these debates as other people, but I'm very curious in this kind of movement of sensuous and non-sensuous, because kind of the way I've thought about this a lot before reading Marx or without Marx is just thinking of kind of capitalism as that which really takes us out of our senses, that which kind of limits the world, makes the world a lot smaller, and kind of the critique or the critical kind of position towards capitalism is putting us back into our senses, and this section I'm referring to, I kind of had some notes here about kind of rethinking that tension through and how sensuous capitalism is, or the commodity is in itself, and I'm just very fascinated that, but at the same time, I think that there is something if we're going to try to be critical of capitalism, that our senses kind of have this priority that I don't know how to. I'm not articulating this very well, but I feel like when we just say that it's kind of both, it leaves some kind of radical potential of the very kind of sensuous character of life that kind of commoditization is destroying, or something like that, to be kind of crude.
I think that's exactly right. That's actually something that I wrote about in a piece, and I'm happy to post it here later. But on a piece on us again called "Against Austerity Towards a New Sensuality." So I think we're thinking in really similar ways around this. And I think the question is that there's a way in which capitalism encourages and seduces us with various kinds of immediate pleasures, right? Certain kinds of egoic pleasures, if you will. And they could be sensuous pleasures, but they often feel like they're serialized pleasures, that there's that moment of the sort of sublime moment of the commodity being transcendent, that you have that moment when, oh man, I finally found that coil, 12-inch that I've been looking for ages and ages, and here it is, and I'm holding it in my hot little hands, or, look at this beautiful, outfit I just got. Now I can put it on. And damn, don't I look sexy, or whatever, and but they're all kind of ego-driven, and it's always the sublime that moment of the commodity fetishism is always the transcendence of the material in the material. And so what's interesting to me is that a real notion of sensuality would actually pull back from that, would recognize the alterity of whatever you're encountering, recognize the sensuality of the thing you are encountering. It would be less of a kind of ego boost or a kind of affirmation of one's avatar life, and more about a kind of something closer to what sensuality has to be about encountering difference and actually paying attention to the sensations you have, being attentive to your body, rather than feeling the sense of transcending your body, which I think commodity pleasures often give us, although maybe that's too easy. I don't know.
I just wanted
really interesting. I was thinking also. Oh, who's going? I'm going. Okay. I was just thinking also about building off of Julian's point and thinking about why the descriptions of the commodity go between like the sensuous and then the ideal. There's also something weirdly animate and inanimate about it. I was thinking about Noah's description of how Marx tries to perform for us in rhetorical terms, how we animate the commodity. There's also a weird sense in which the commodity is like dead labor. It's both animate and inanimate. It seems to like occupy an unusual position on like what our spectrum of how we consider like what is alive and what is dead. It seems to be in a weird place, spectral. Something's unusual about that, and I wonder if that's maybe part of the reason why the language is also unusual in its emphasis on the sensual, the ideal, it's dead matter, kind of like in that weird circuit. But
I agree, and that's where Derrida, of course, picks up on Marx precisely because of his idea of spectrality, and I think that is there is that rich notion there of something that's something that's both codified or fixed, but also not fully sensuous in its materiality, and it's hard, it's got that spectral quality.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, this is kind of relating back to a bit of what Carlos was saying, and trying to think about use value and stuff. And one of the real difficulties I've had kind of reading this and trying to think about the methodology is just, it's when he's talking about linen and a coat and stuff, and just to kind of relate that to kind of my experience or what we see as kind of capitalism today, and what are commodities. It seems as if the kind of yeah, that everything is so spectral, everything is so immaterial, and you know, I'm not well versed in the kind of immaterial labor conceptions of Hart and Negri, but just to me, kind of like, you know, the music festival now is like the archetype of capitalism. You know, it's like this. There isn't really a commodity per se there, or not a commodity, but there isn't a thing as much, and so I'm always struggling to kind of relate Marx to things that I directly experience like that. I don't know, kind of a rant.
No, I think, you know, I think that kind of tension inheres in precisely what Marx is getting at. I wanted to shift really quickly, if we can do that, to the issue of slavery, because I know a couple of you were interested in that, and Ashley, I wanted to pick up on you know, your interest in that, because he actually you know, he talks about the U.S. Civil War on page 93, among other things, right? This is in the preface to the first edition, and I'm trying to remember which edition this is. Oh, it's just the regular preface to the first edition. So he says, and obviously this is right after the Civil War, but at the same time as on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, Mr. Wade, Vice President of the United States, has declared in public meeting that after the abolition of slavery, a radical transformation in the existing relations of capital and landed property is on the agenda. These are signs of the times, not hidden by the purple mantles or black cassocks. They do not signify that tomorrow's miracle will occur. They do show that within the ruling classes themselves, the foreboding is emerging that the present society is no solid crystal. Notice again that complicated material language, right? But an organism, which is also interesting, capable of change and constantly engaged in the process of change. What strikes me as interesting there is that Marx is really thinking of slaves as laborers, as he should, which I'm very much struck by. As you know, that I remember some of the debates in the 90s. People were like, "Well, can Marxism really be applied to slavery and this and that?" But it's very clear that Marx actually thought of it as in fact intersecting with issues of slavery, and you know, this also gets picked up by certain world systems thinkers like Quijano, what's his, I can't think of his first name right now, but Anibal Quijano, who talk about how race is actually a category of labor as much as it's an identity or subjectivity category. You know, category of subjectification is maybe the better way of putting it. But the category of labor, and he argues that wage labor in the first world, or not in the first world, wage labor in the so-called New World, is always associated with whiteness, whereas unwaged and enforced labor is always associated with people of color. And so there's an interesting way in which race becomes actually absolutely central to the system, and economic and slavery becomes absolutely central to that, to a certain Marxist account of the system, rather than this peripheral issue that somehow is superseded by wages. Thoughts on this from the folks who are working on slavery?
Chris, I kept looking for a place where, and this goes to actually a question that Tyler had posed in the chat. I keep looking for ways to think about slave bodies not just in terms of labor, which is useful in certain ways, of course, but in the ways in which those bodies are commodified. So in the earlier discussion around the kind of tension or dialectic between concretization and idealization, I think is helpful. What I was doing a while ago was actually looking at every use of the word imaginary, because I thought that might be a key, but I haven't found a place where that language intersects with slavery, which I think is interesting. In any case, how does Marx then help us think about how the slave body is functioning in these multiple ways? So it is producing labor, but then in other ways it is itself a commodity. And that seems like actually a real place where the tension between abstraction and concretization could be usefully looked at, among many other things. But that's one thing that occurred to me. And my second point is this moment when I was reading on 93 in the preface of the first edition, this moment you just pointed to, what really occurs to me is that I don't really think that there was a radical transformation in the existing relations of capital and landed property, right? And I mean, all of these books that have come out recently, the new Jim Crow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, point to how much that's true. And so I'm interested in that failure as well. But I'm not quite sure where to go with that. But yeah, there are other moments where he points to Greek slavery and other forms of slavery. But I haven't yet found a moment, perhaps I've missed it, where he's really theorizing the slave body as functioning at different levels, and I'm really curious how much his theorization is willing or able to do that, a body as both object and, for example, we could look at female slave bodies and their kind of forced reproduction is yet another form of very complex labor and commodification at the same time. So I'm not at all sure how to put those things together, but that's the crux I'm stuck at the moment.
No, that makes a lot of sense. No, it makes total sense to me. Before I jump in, I feel like I'm doing too much managing of things. So anybody want to jump in on that before rather than me just responding?
Probably all of you know more about this than I do. How's that? So probably anybody could help me.
No. My sense is that that's exactly right, and that slavery and bodies in slavery become one version of literal commodification. I mean, the commodification of the body is such the slave becomes a commodity very directly, and it's not just one's labor that's the commodity, which is what happens in capitalism, and is part of, and we'll get to that. It's part of Marx's account of the extraction of surplus value, but. I think it's also what's also interesting there is the way in which the body is linked to, and I know you work on this, Ashley, and biopolitics and thanato or necropolitics there. The kind of extraction of the forced extraction of value out of these bodies in various ways. But it also becomes a oh shoot, what was I going to say? I lost my train of thought here. But yeah, I think that there's a way in which the body becomes, a commodified entity. Oh, I know what I was also going to say. It also becomes a place of almost explicit accumulation by dispossession. And one of the interesting things that I think that Harvey has done by taking Marx's category of primitive accumulation, which we'll get to later, and turn it into accumulation by dispossession, is demonstrate that that's always going on in capitalism. It isn't just something that happens at the beginning of capitalism. That at least on a global stage, you always have certain people who are getting exploited via wages, while there's other populations that are, and often populations marked by gender and race, that are being exploited very directly by just the sheer appropriation of their labor without any kind of remuneration. So it made me think of that.
Just to touch on that, Chris, I mean, that's Quijano's point, and the essay is, I'll give you guys a link for it. It's called, it's a very, very well-known essay in Latin American studies. It's called Coloniality of Power, Eurocentrism in Latin America, and I forget the third term. Sorry, Coloniality of Power, Eurocentrism in Latin America. 3 terms. But really, I'll go ahead and put that, but this is exactly what...
Huh? No, I haven't heard from her, Bob.
It's just her and Ava.
So just the two of them?
I think
I hear
so.
somebody
We need to get gas for the car.
Okay.
I didn't know
I'm gonna.
Vermont was a state. Well, you didn't even. This place is outside of Woodstock. We took so long to get there, we didn't actually ever go into Woodstock.
Somebody's having a conversation that's sort of off topic.
My battery's low. Do we have a charger?
Jason, can you mute it, please?
No, I think I left it in the car.
There's no charger in the car.
Okay.
We looked for
This is gonna get intimate very
one
quickly.
upstairs.
When there's no charger in the car, everything breaks down. Okay. Anybody with a long-term relationship knows that the car charger is a thing.
Which slot was that?
It was Phillips.
Okay, yeah, I think it's you, Philip.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know if can you hear me? I don't even know if I have a microphone or this works. I've never kind of done this thing before.
Oh yeah, no, it's okay. Did you want to jump in?
Well, just what Carlos was saying before. I remember a debate between Ernesto Laclau and I think Wallerstein and the world systems theory about whether or not slavery was capitalism. And I think one of the issues that I've thought about with this is that Ellen Mason Woods and Brenner and so forth want to, I think, point to a beginning to capitalism, a point in time when it began, as opposed to getting to one of those notions where class struggle is eternal and therefore you can find capitalism in the Roman world. And so there's an attempt to try to distinguish it by the quality of wage labor from everything else before according to the Brenner and Woods theory, is not capitalism. And a possibility that there's a new book by Tom Brass called Regimes of Labor or something, where he talks about how, in fact, capitalism can quite obviously now work with precarious or unwaged labor or slave labor. It fits very well into the process of accumulation. So I put forward the theory that it's possible that, in fact, once capitalism itself gets going, it kind of absorb anything and commoditize it and turn it into capital. It may be that in its own emergence, it needed to utilize elements that were distinct from what was around, but once the motor starts going, anything can be absorbed into the accumulation process as long as MCM prime keeps getting up. So long-windedly, I guess what I'm saying is there is a possibility that slavery wasn't capitalism at one time, but it quite obviously is now. That's just it's my thought. It has no grounding in Marx or anyone else.
Can I touch on that for a second, Philip?
Absolutely.
I just wanted to maybe include a little bit of periodization. I'll put the reference for the Tom Brass book over here in the sidebar. It's a little thing that I do for you guys. But if you look at the Quijano essay, I think it really does. I think it sidesteps this question by elegantly sort of framing it in the question of the development of a particular kind of way of thinking that is endemic to capitalism, aka modernity, that can be applied to almost any establishment of difference in order to create a kind of domination that will then be taken up by MCM prime. Right. In other words, like I don't think Quijano has gotten some criticism for not being sufficiently Marxist, for using this concept of race as a sort of reified meta concept that isn't tied to social relations, but all he says in this essay, my reading, this is my interpretation, is actually race is just another thing, sort of like the use value of an object that can be manipulated and transformed into the circuit of exchange value. It can be used as part of the mechanism to extract surplus value from, and it can be applied to notions of sort of abstract labor, dead labor, the industrial reserve army. I mean, race is just another thing we can use. And if you, I mean, we're going off on a tangent, but I don't know, Ashley, if you know the book by Susan Buck Morris, Hegel, Haiti, and Slavery.
Hegel, Haiti.
Yeah, that's. I mean, this is essentially her thesis, right? That the Hegelian notion of the master-slave dialectic forgets actual slavery in the New World, and that there's a particular way of doing slavery as capital that is endemic to the New World. So, I mean, that's the way that I see it with regards to Quijano, at least from the position of a Latin Americanist. So I'm with all of you guys on this. I think we're in agreement to some degree that this conjunctural moment isn't fully capitalism, but that's not really the question that we need to explore, perhaps. You know, the sort of how pin straight our capitalism is. I'll get off that now.
Just as a quick follow-up, and maybe we should take another question from the people following on YouTube and stuff. Just a quick follow-up to that. To me, and I'm very influenced by Wallerstein and the world systems folks, so I'm probably coming at it from that one side. And Philip, you're right. It depends whether you're on McLeod's side or Wallerstein's side, among other things, in this. And I think they both have good arguments. But to me, capitalism isn't about industrialism as much as to me, capitalism is about the generation of capital, right? It's about as you were saying, Philip, it's about that movement, MCM, or even, M to M prime, if you want, without the C, and we can get into that later. But, but it's about the generation of money for the sake of investing to make even more money. That's, and that can happen in agriculture as much as it can happen in industry. And in fact, part of what's, and it doesn't have to have wage labor attached to it, to my mind. You can generate money by investing money in slaves as much as you can do it in workers. One of the interesting things, and this comes back to Ashley's point about the Civil War not actually being this great break. Is that in fact one of the sort of harder economic arguments about the Civil War was that actually the slave plantation system was not actually making money by the end, and in fact it kind of needed to switch to sharecropping for it to become productive for a little while again. And so there's a way in which the historical economic logic was also sort of mixed in with the political and moral logic of that moment as well.
No, that makes sense. I guess the one thing to watch out is when one uses the word capital to not fall into the neoclassical habit of having it refer to money occasionally, and remembering that capital is the entire circuit where things metamorpho, where everything appears as money, as slaves, as commodities, as machinery. I think my one takeaway from the Mason Woods thing is there's a point where afterwards there's something called a market imperative, where if you have money, if it's not making money, you're a schmuck, and where time is never time in the same way again, unless it's expended towards expanding your M into M prime. And one can almost sense a change when that happens, and we're obviously caught up in that now. So that's what I take away from that particular debate, to rather than any kind of exact attempt to anatomize what is capitalism, what is not. Obviously, everything can be at some point from now on.
That makes absolute sense, Philip. I know Jason at one point wrote to me that we should take some more questions from the people sort of watching on YouTube and stuff. Is there a question does it come up on the link over here? I think it does. Go ahead.
We actually haven't gotten any more from YouTube. That one was already brought up. It was the one about object-oriented ontology. So that already happened.
Oh, okay.
I do have something to bring up regarding Marx and the Civil War, and particularly that quote that you pointed to earlier, Chris, in the preface to the first edition on page 93, where he writes, "At the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, Mr. Wade, Vice President of the United States, has declared in public meetings that after the abolition of slavery, a radical transformation in the existing relations of capital and landed property is on the agenda." There's actually an historical inaccuracy here, that there was no Vice President Wade. That refers to Benjamin Wade, who was a senator, and who was so radical that was actually next in line for the presidency had Johnson been removed from office.
That's hilarious. That's great. Yeah, Mark. Nobody's going to claim that Marx is 100% accurate in terms of his facts all the time. Although there's that whole ridiculous set of exchanges in the preface, right, about that one fact that kind of cracked me up too. I'd forgotten about that.
Just as a total. This is like this is where you can see how the logic or the communications technology of blogging is 200, 300 years old. Because Marx was getting all of this stuff via the telegraph and newspaper clippings that were sent to him by his buddies, you know, and creating this whole kind of logic through this telecommunications. So telecomputation and sort of in its not nearly as fun fashion. You can't play Tetris with your Marx, but I love that bit. Imagining Marx reading about Wade as Senator Pro Tem, you know, President Pro Tem of the Senate, and just some weird, you know, cobbled together newspaper. I love it. It's a cute image. Sorry.
Well, I also find it really interesting in that it points to the madness of the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, and how he could very well have been president had Johnson been removed from office, and then things would have maybe it would have been very different, perhaps. I mean, we can posit like alternative histories if we wanted to, but I mean, I find it interesting that era actually points to something about how American politics works.
But I think it's also very interesting as the problem of transition, which occurs again and again when one tries to institute a new order after a revolution or the end of a particular era. And I think the famous phrase "dictatorship of the proletariat" that was not that occurred only in 3 or 4 of Marx's letters is his recognition that during a problem of transition, a moment of transition, things have to be dictated, as in fact they attempted to do during the first part of Reconstruction before it was overthrown by the Ku Klux Klan. So.
Yeah, and I mean, what's interesting in all these spaces are a sort of sense of the real political stakes, that these are moments not of kind of political stasis or what feels like, you know, there is no alternative, or, you know, that it doesn't have the feeling of contemporary neoliberalism at all. You know, and maybe that's starting to change now with Greece and with other things. I mean, you know, we hope. But you know, you do get the sense that, and Jeffrey, as you were pointing out, you know, there's a sense of different historical possibilities. You know, these sort of Benjaminian moments, right, where you could brush history against the grain and find another. You know, there could have been another history here.
Yeah.
Chris, can I ask a question going back to the page 102, the discussion of Hegel? Because thinking about this moment that we've come back to on page 93 about the fictional vice president, and this larger question of Reconstruction, it seems to me that by the time we get to 1877, 88, and the end of Reconstruction, and the failure and kind of reversal, so we have this moment when we have all these African-American politicians, right, and then all of that gets reversed. I guess in my head, maybe slightly unself-reflexively, I've always thought, well, of course that was going to happen because ideologically the possibility of an African American as not only a subject but a citizen and a political voice was always going to be kind of impossible. But I realize I'm thinking very ideologically here, which brings me back to that passage on 102, moving from the real to the ideal, moving from the ideal to the real. So I'm thinking about how to put this. How do we get them from a Marxian moving from the real to the ideal, from that to how I think of him through kind of more contemporary writers as reflecting ideological conditions, producing the real, which I'm now realizing is how I've always thought about Marx, and one of the explanations I would give for the failure of Reconstruction and so on. I'm not sure I'm formulating my question very clearly, but I'm just recognizing one of my own limitations in the assumptions I've made about Marx, and it brings me back to this passage about Hegel. So I'm struggling with this question of, okay, so then how does the real then proceed to the ideal, and how much is he saying that ideological conditions reproduce themselves, which I know I'm thinking more in Althuserian terms when I say that, but I have kind of a question floating in there somewhere. So I'm kind of asking.
I think it's a really...
So go, Chris. You want to go? No?
Oh, sure. Or somebody else wants to go ahead.
I don't have a full form.
Does somebody else want to go? I've spoken a lot, so go ahead and I'll say what I I'll try and it'll give me time to think.
Yeah, definitely tell us what you were going to say. I was thinking about that passage a lot as well, and I was wondering maybe if like thinking about for Marx and going from the real to the ideal, or just starting from the real means not starting from ideology in a way, right? I mean starting historically, and I think that might be one way to like think about that problem. So you're not necessarily just starting with the real as in like what you can touch and what's produced by ideology, but like starting with like a historical materialist way of like understanding what's about, and then proceeding from there to something else. I don't know if that helps, or if that's correct. Like I'd be curious to hear what Chris says as well.
I think that's right, and I think it's also one of Raymond Williams. My favorite definition of materialism for Marx was Raymond Williams's account, and obviously this is a kind of one side of it. It's Williams trying to work back from some of the ossifications of like the Second and Third International and stuff like that. But my favorite definition is from Williams' Marxism in Literature, if I'm remembering it correctly. I may have made this up at this point. I teach it all the time. Who knows if it's actually true? But he says that materialism for Marx is a setting of limits. It's a setting of limits on what is possible. That means that there's all kinds of agency possible in these spaces, but materialism sets limits. Ideology is one of the other things that sets limits by, in fact, covering over contradictions. To me, the commodity fetish is the best account of ideology in Marx, because it's so complex and it's so rich in various ways. But the other version of ideology I really like in Marx, and that distinguishes it to me from something like Foucault, which would be, in terms of discourse and the shaping of discourses, which I love. I'm not bashing Foucault here. Is that Marx says ideology covers over or makes sense of material contradictions. And so one of the questions becomes, and this comes back, Ashley, to your question, is in fact there was a material contradiction existing in that moment of the Reconstruction, a really rich one in which there was an attempt at racial democracy, right, that was trying to be established, multiracial democracy, and yet that was in tension with the larger economic and social beliefs and practices, both material and ideological, within the U.S. at that point. And so then you get a kind of reaction, but the reaction isn't inevitable. I think it comes back to Jeff's point as well, that that's one way history could have gone. But there might have been other ways to exploit that contradiction. And so to me, that's part of, in his most recent book, Ontocartography, which I'm making my way through, Levi Bryant talks about the way in which people after Marx really went towards ideology as thinking about Marxism. It sort of corresponds to what you were just talking about, Ashley, in your question, that we all learned Marx via Althusser and via Raymond Williams and via all these people who took a very culturalist direction with Marx. But Marx himself isn't that. He's actually someone, or at least, I mean, this is Bryant's argument. We can debate this, but his argument at least is that Marx is actually much more materialist in a sense that's transcends culture and not just intersects with culture, or resists culture and language and isn't just shaped by culture and language, if that makes sense. And I think that there's some real, if you all think that.
Well, there are a lot of dates in Marx, chapters on the working day, on primitive accumulation, the history of technology, none of which you find in someone like Lukács or theorists who come afterwards. With Marx, you get this strange combination of both theory and history, but a theory that's not a flat ontology, but that suggests there's a difference between what's happening in the depths and what one reads on the surface. So you have both someone who's schooled in metaphysical philosophy, but someone who has also studied very, very concretely, with the help of Engels, for 30 or 40 years, capitalism in England, the way no thinker had ever studied some economic engine before this.
I think that's a really good point, Philip. Chris, one of the things I wanted to address is we talk a lot about the fetishism of commodity, or the commodity fetishism, but we forget too that there's also the fetishism of money. I mean, it's something that's later on in 186 in the process of the exchange. The only reason I talk about this is to sort of I think affirm and buttress your point about Marx being much more materialist, but also talk about this question of ideology as, I guess, a suture for all these different relations that is productive. And actually, in many ways, Marx, when Marx talks about how the producer of value only sees the commodity from two points, it doesn't really say that if you're outside of ideology, or if you have an ideological critique of the commodity, that there's actually anything useful or relevant. That there needs to be a theory of crisis and a theory of other things happening, and this is where the sort of Welt critique and other people are working on. But that's just one of ideology's functions, like you said, is this question of bringing together that beautiful quote that you remembered, make sense of material contradictions, and this is a sensible relation, and it's a perfectly acceptable relation for capitalism, and it's a relation that can operate alongside its so-called true opposite. Ideology and truth are not mutually exclusive, except they relate to each other through material practices and through material contract. And I think that's one of the things that's important. In the sidebar, we're having this conversation about race, and a kind of economistic version of Marx would say that race can only exist as a kind of concept and epiphenomenon of class relations. And Quijano's own point and other points is that precisely race can take on a kind of ideological form, and if we follow Marx closely, this can make sense of material contradictions that are not necessarily purely economic, not necessarily where we fit in the relations of production. You know.
Okay, so we do have a question from the Facebook chat now. Or sorry, am I interrupting? Okay. So this is the question from the Facebook chat. Basically says, this is from Oliver Odner, and he says, it's more of a comment, but I thought I would share it. He says, we appear to be heading towards a perhaps inverted thesis whereby supply is not created to meet demand, but rather demand is created to meet supply. This seems to forcibly justify capital's demand for surplus labor, which appears fundamentally to be based on an inexhaustible drawing of value from price, and ideally exceeding it. Thus, reproduction can be said to be geared primarily to the supply of priced demanders, serving materially the redistributive potential of surplus value. So I don't know if anybody would like to bounce back off that. You're welcome to.
Whoa.
That's Oliver Arthur.
Can you repeat that last little bit while I make something up?
Yeah, the last part is, thus reproduction can be said to be geared primarily to the supply of price demanders, serving materially the redistributive potential of surplus value.
Well, okay. To me,
one more time.
Yeah.
Okay, thus reproduction.
Oh wait, no.
Be said. What's that? Thus reproduction.
There's a weird loop.
Thus, reproduction can be said to be geared primarily to the supply of price demanders, serving materially the redistributive potential of surplus value.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow the question.
Can I just say something real quick?
I'm not sure I follow the question completely.
If we talk about Oliver's point where demand is created to meet supply, I mean, Marx is pretty clear about this when he talks about crisis of overproduction. I mean, there are times where you have I mean, capitalism has a tendency towards crisis, and one of the main crises is overproduction. And what does Marx say? I'll look for the page. What are the ways to deal with this overproduction? You know, a part above and beyond the reduction of relative surplus labor, right? You create a war, to just to open up new markets, you destroy inventory, or you manipulate prices in order for the market to kind of bounce back. So this is a question that he anticipates, and he develops it further in Capitalism Volume 3. I mean, this is Capital Volume 3. Capitalist crises are manageable, but they aren't exclusively manageable from within capital, and capital is aware of this. That's why it appeals to other organizations historically, like the state or the police or the aristocracy or whatever, in order to do their bidding to materially change the situation. The best example I have is war. There's that old Dead Kennedys song where it's 15 minutes of Jello Biafra and having a conversation about starting a war in order to open up new markets. And Marx had this centuries before financialization became a sort of way of reassessing crisis away from capitalist production. That's my bit. I'll find the footnote.
Oh, no, that's beautifully put, Carlos. Very well said. And I agree completely. And I also think that one of the things that the question gets at, which I want to think about, is not only Fordism was an attempt in part to actually build up demand in order to in order to deal with the crisis of overproduction. And neoliberal organization was attempting to do that. Both in terms of wage suppression, but also, we still get, there's all kinds of the manufacturing of needs, happens all the time within contemporary capitalism. I mean, the idea that, that we need we now live in a disposable society in which we need the next cell phone every 2 years, or, whatever pair of shoes I buy is ready to fall apart, 2 days later, or whatever it is. But to me, the other question here, and I think it's a really important one, is the relationship between price and value that takes up much of Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 especially. And I don't think that I think that's one of the places where Marx really, I remember Bob Meister saying this, who was a Marxist economist at Santa Cruz, where I did my Ashley and I did our, some of our, I did my graduate work, but one of the things he said was that nobody's ever been able to really figure out the relationship between price and value, because Marx wants to hang on to this notion of value as something that is measurable in terms of abstract equivalent labor time, right? And it becomes about and what you have to do is reduce it down to its most simple form. So it becomes not specialist labor, but just sort of brute labor. I forget the word he uses. Anyway, that becomes a question. How does price, and this becomes one of the real questions with financialization. Financialization seems to generate money, ex nihilo. It seems to generate it out of itself. But then you have these corrections, like the collapse in 2008. One of the questions become: is there still a relationship between value, as Marx considers it, and price, or was he not able to see as far into the future as something like financialization?
Well, I have no answers for this. I've tried to read what they say over at value form theory against what Robert Kurtz would say in crisis theory, and by no means able to sum up intelligently Michael Heinrich and people's position. But I think their argument is that Marx is, when one refers to Marx, one refers to not a totally coherent body of doctrine, but to a kind of style of thinking that kept rethinking over many years in the face of crises that didn't come or didn't have the same effects. Things that he had written about earlier, even in early parts of Capital. And when you look at the new mega edition and everything that's being translated now, and all the things that are in German that I haven't read but they've read, the impression Heinrich conveys is that a lot of the attempts to convert value into price or something were points where Marx fell back into using some of the same assumptions which he'd already critiqued philosophically the neoclassical economics it had. I mean, how can you transform value, which is abstract labor, which is something that can't be measured, into something as concrete, and price, which Marx says in other times in his books, reflects merely supply and demand, so can't tell us anything about real values. So I don't know where to take us. It's a complex thing that seems to be being struggled over now in theory.
I have Heinrich's book on capital here, and it's sort of, in some ways, it's kind of served to reorient my reading of capital. In fact, I read it sort of alongside Stephen Shapiro book on how to read capital, and you could have a whole reading group on these kind of ways of reading capital. And one of the things that Heinrich talks about, just real quickly, in his interpretation of the question of the money commodity, is that for Marx, I guess price is sort of the only way for money to actually express itself. So money itself is, fetishizes itself as a commodity that gets exchanged. We need the money commodity for capital. We actually don't need abstract labor for capital. We need money plus these other things for capital. So, I mean, Heinrich is critical of, I know he's critical of Kleeman, and in his sort of single stream temporal inconsistency model, which says that Marx is not inconsistent at all, and we can find these answers to financialization and crisis. And I haven't gotten to that work yet, but one of the things we could at least put on the table is the idea that money can only express the magnitude of value of a commodity is expressed in its price, and this is the only possibility for the magnitude of value to be expressed. And the magnitude of value, remember, is built from from the relationship between necessary labor value and surplus value and all the different things. And if the magnitude of a commodity's value changes, there's a new relationship of the individual expended labor to the total labor of society. Then the price of the commodity changes. And here's the kicker, and I can put this up. I have a PDF of this book, so I can put up this page. However, the reverse is not the case. Not every price is the expression of a specific magnitude of value, nor does every change in price indicate a change in the magnitude of value. Right? So prices exist kind of on their own to reflect this relationship. And changes of price don't necessarily work backwards to show us anything relevant about the structure that created value. They're epiphenomena of market of money as a commodity. I think that's what Heinrich wants to put on the table.
That's what I would have said had I your eloquence.
Oh no, I just have the book in front of me. But but I guess maybe I'm just seeing Marx as I don't know, maybe I'm just like seeing him as a world builder. Now I'm gonna go be quiet now.
Sorry, doing too many things. Since we're running close to being out of time, do we want to start thinking about, well, first of all, if anybody who hasn't spoken at all, like I know people have been speaking in the side chat, which is great as well, and I am really not good at following two things at once, unfortunately. But does anybody want to pipe, or does anybody want to pitch in or say something who hasn't had a chance to really speak yet? Because that would be great. Leanne or Esther or anybody?
Well, I can't remember exactly where it is now. I do wonder about the idea of the gold standard and how that even applies today. I know it was almost unfathomable to not be on some sort of monetary standard during Marx's time. And I haven't read anything contemporary about that, and I was wondering if anyone had anything to input on that.
Well, I have a side announcement. I have a room called Reading Money on Facebook, which tries essentially to ask questions about money and the gold standard and so forth rather than answering them, or see Deleuze on money, or some of the new books like The Social Life of Money and What Money Wants, or which are new to discuss it. And it needs more people who are interested in those questions to write in it. So I encourage everybody here to just look into the room and leave your name and ask, and we continue to research the difference that the lack of a gold standard has met. I think what I've read about it is that Marx has been dismissed as a commodity money theorist, since we now know that money is not a commodity because we're no longer on the gold standard. But a lot of people make the argument that something about the commodityness of money sticks around, even though we're off the gold standard. But it seems that almost nobody knows what money is since 1971, since a lot of the theories that are often, or a lot of the way people pretend to think about money, they obviously don't really think about money. They represent a kind of disavowal of the fact that there's really nothing there. It's created out of thin air. So whether one supplies the commodity or whether it somehow attains commodityness in some way or another, these are, to me, very interesting questions. And there is a book called Marx on Money, which is available on one of the various sites that are circulating around that have all sorts of various essays and some of the positions about this, or not. But I'm a student of this rather than any kind of authority of it.
Thank you, Philip. That's really rich and really helpful. And I think this is a really open question right now. It's something I've been wrestling with. I did an essay on financialization that's coming out from Cultural Critique soon, but I'm not sure I got it right there. I think it's a really hard question. How do we think about what creates value within capitalism and how that relates to systems of money? And I do think that this is one place where Marx was really still a 19th century thinker, even though he's very proleptic in a number of ways. But this is one of the places where I think he really can't imagine paper money not pegged to gold in some or silver in some shape or form. Even as he creates a kind of early account or kind of proto account of the arbitrariness of the signifier, which he talks about on 195, where he actually talks about he actually talks about the arbitrariness of signs of money. This is let me see if I can find it here. This is page number. Page 95. In the same way, or he says, the name of the thing is entirely external to its nature. I know nothing of man if I merely know his name is Jacob. In the same way, every trace of the money relation disappears in the money names pound, thaler, franc, franc, ducat, etc. The confusion caused by attributing a hidden meaning to these Kabbalistic signs is made even greater by the fact that these money names express both values of commodities and simultaneously aliquot parts of a certain weight of metal, namely the weight of the metal which serves as the standard of money. On the other hand, it is in fact necessary that value, as opposed to the multifarious objects of the world of commodities, should develop into this form, a material and non-mental one, but also a simple social form. And I think that's part of the contradiction that Marx is working with, but he couldn't quite see how that contradiction would evolve, which is in fact what you get is just pure signs with money. You get this. Go ahead.
I'm not sure if. Okay, I want to maybe since we're almost out of time, we can return to this or in Chapter 3, money, the circulation of commodities. I mean, maybe I'm too generous to Marx. When he talks about, he assumes that gold is the money commodity for the sake of simplicity. And then he goes into this incredible work to talk about things like money as a measure of value is the necessary form of appearance of the measure of value, which is immanent in commodities, namely labor time. And I'm not sure, I'm going to reread this again because I've always read Marx that way. In point of fact, I've never really been able to quite wrap my head around the contradictory notion of Marx on the gold standard. Rather, on page 190, he talks about if two different commodities, such as gold and silver, serve simultaneously as measures of value, all commodities will have two separate price expressions, okay, the price of gold and the price of silver, which will quietly coexist, as long as they have a certain relationship. And he goes on to talk about how this is a social form, like why gold. It's almost like World of Warcraft. He's always like X gold, Y gold, like you have like this D&D amount of gold. But I don't really, and joking, of course, because I couldn't resist making that joke about Dungeons and Dragons. But I'm really serious about the fact that I'm not sure that Marx believes that gold, that any sort of metal form of money is actually anything else than a sort of the sign, right? It's the sort of rigid signifier that actually disguises what he calls the I'm going to reread it one more time because I'm horrible with quotes. The necessary form of appearance. That's what I take it to be. So
I would also add right in that section,
I'm happy to concur.
190, 191, 192. I went onto Amazon and did a search of the book for the word imaginary.
Yeah.
And all of that discussion of imaginary is also where the discussion of the signify, well, for example, the bottom of 189, right, he uses the phrase it is signified through their equality with gold and so on. So I think what the point you're both making about this kind of signification and slippery connection and value, I think looking at the word imaginary turned out to be one key for looking into that. But it's all pervasive through this period. So 185, 190, 191, 192, 197, 204, 213. But there's kind of a concentration right in that section at the beginning of chapter 3. So I do think that is one place to get started. Sorry for the noise over here. But anyway, yeah, so I think that was kind of the feeling I had in one place I was really interested.
Yeah, I think Marx has a much more complex view of money than any, to say he's a 19th century economist. I mean, the economics that starts in the 19th century treats money as if it's a veil for real exchanges in the economy, that essentially you have barter, and money is just the medium that makes it possible. For Marx, it's very clear that money has huge effects on capitalism. And what's interesting is the distinction between money and credit, because now the credit theory of money has become popular again, even with people like David Graeber and so forth. He's been critiqued for the idea that, as people say, well, since we know that money is only credit, credit is either extended or not. But evidently, some German Marxists say that Marx made a distinction between money and credit that's important to attend to. And I couldn't exactly state what it is, but it would be a thread to follow as we read through to see how what the difference is between money and credit for Marx.
I completely concede the point. I think both of you have convinced me, so thank you. I'm always happy to think that Marx is actually right. But we should actually talk about what we want to read for next time, how much we want to take care of, and and I like that Ashley offered. Let's also think about what we want to focus on as we read too. Maybe next time we can actually even generate the questions ahead of time a little bit, and then we can list them and work from them in the side scroll. I'm getting more used to working with the side scroll thing. So, how far do people want to read to next time?
Wherever.
I think we could probably just read the entirety of part 2.
That sounds reasonable. Although with this question of credit, let me see. It's Well, I guess we'll get to it later. I was thinking we could skip around, but that's probably not wise.
I actually meant part 2 and 3. Part 2 is like 30 pages long.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, that's fair. That's fair. So part 2, and yeah, that seems more okay. Yeah, okay. I'm up for it.
So part 2 and part 3, is that what we're?
Oh,
I'd
what?
actually. Can I make a suggestion? Maybe it's gonna leave it a little bit pending or some points hanging. But the way, I guess, from my reading of Heinrich and other things, it might be useful to go all the way to the end of chapter 12, the concept of relative surplus value, because other commentators have registered this break between relative surplus value and cooperation within this chapter. Again, it's really provisional, and I might be suggesting something that I will regret, but I think it would be really useful for us to put these terms like relative surplus value and absolute surplus value in circulation as they're starting to emerge, and they will have relevance with notions of credit, notions of financialization, because these are ways that people like Kleeman attack this kind of financialization fetish. So maybe that's just my 2 cents.
No, it makes sense to me. I might even say we should push it because we only going to have we got 3 more meetings, so I'd like to actually do the whole thing if possible, and people can read around, but I was thinking even up to chapter 15 and then just stop it there. That's still only like what, 200, a little over 200 pages, 240.
Chapter 18, man. I'm just going to say.
So, here we go.
Just going to say that's
here
torture. I don't know.
Everybody's outbidding each other.
No, that's too much, I think. I know.
I will not read that.
I think let's.
For sake of argument.
No, that's too much. Why don't we just go to does up through chapter 14 work for people?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. Why don't we do that?
So basically,
to
the end of part 4 is what we're thinking.
Basically, yes.
Oh, I thought that was in the middle of part 4.
That is the middle of part 4. I was saying to the middle of part 4. So like right around page 500. So up through 492, basically.
Okay, let's just write that down.
Okay. So all of part 2, all of part 3, and the first 3 chapters in part 4.
Perfect.
Okay, excellent. Folks, this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it. I hope I didn't talk too much. This has been really, really good.
Thanks.
Likewise.
Yeah, thank you. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
Thanks all.
Thank
I'm going to sign out.
Yep.
Yeah,
Bye.
looking forward to next week.
Yeah, see you all next week.
All right.
Bye.
Yep, see ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
How do we do that?
Bye.